Alright guys, well I just spent the last hour and a half or so, maybe 2 hours, making sure that this was lined up correctly and then match drilling it. It went extremely well. I actually piloted this with an A3 bit through every layer of metal this time on this top side of the horizontal stabilizer here, and that made match drilling it a lot easier. Match drilling will take two dissimilar holes and line them up properly and drill them, to a matched size. On the top side of the stabilizer, all I did was pilot hole the first layer of material with A3 and then just drilled through with A4, and then occasionally had to open it up to an A5. But I found that even though drilling with an A3 all the way through everything first was a lot more drilling, it made match drilling these much easier and produced better results. I didn't have any bit walk or anything like that, so the holes, some of the original holes I drilled where I just drilled A4 to begin with, I ended up with some mismatch holes that I then had to drill to A5 to match size. So I'm going to recommend that you guys, if your plan's building, start out with an A3 pilot for your, your top layer. Use that to line everything up, and then continue with the A3 until you get everything all match drilled and clecoed, and then do a final match drilling with the A4. It just produced a much better result for me. It does not appear that I have much, if any at all, twist in this final structure. There's some ripples in the skin too that are what make it look like it has some twist when it actually doesn't. So very pleased with the way this turned out. I've just got to take the clecos out, but I still have some final drilling to do here on where the brackets go. And I have to trim the skin out here, and then the two spots where the front brackets stick out the bottom. So I've got a little bit more work to do on this before I can close it up, prime it and close it up, but I'm getting much closer. And pretty soon I'll be ready to skin the elevator. I've got the elevator mostly, actually I've got the elevator skeleton completely match drilled, so I just need to skin that and I'll be good to go. So spent about 8.5 to 9 hours on this today, just drawing down that skin and making sure everything was lined up properly, measuring where the holes had to go, pilot holing them, drawing the skin back down onto the skeleton, match drilling it, and making sure there weren't any ripples anywhere. So it took a little bit of time to do it, but I think it turned out excellent. I'm very happy with it so far. I hope when I take it all apart, everything looks good on the inside, and that'll be what I work on tomorrow. As you can see, these are all the primed parts, and I've got all the mating surfaces here primed with yellow zinc chromate. And so when I had the assembled horizontal stabilizer cleco together, everything was match drilled, the skin was already done. I then had to take it all apart, deburr it, clean, degrease everything, polish out any corrosion issues that I had, and then Scotch-Brite the entire thing. And then at that point, I then washed it thoroughly with dish soap and rinsed it completely, and then primed it. So it's a lot of prep work just to get these surfaces primed and ready to be put together. So I'm now starting assembly. So basically you just put it all back together with clecos and then start riveting. What I'm doing here is attaching the nose ribs and the center ribs, or the rear ribs if you will, to the front spar. And the reason I don't have the rear spar attached just yet is because on these ribs here, you have to have rear access here because these get back riveted. So my pneumatic riveter here, which is the Harbor Freight model 93458 right there, okay, set at 90 psi on the air compressor. You need to be able to get in and rivet from each direction. So you can do that on the you can rivet from the front if you bend the flange on these nose ribs. If you bend the nose ribs over while they're still clecoed in place, you can rivet on the front flange like that. But these rear ribs are made out of 16 thou, whereas the front ribs are made out of 25 thousandths. So the 16 thousandths back here is much easier to just kind of maneuver out of the way and back rivet. So everything else will get front riveted, and then once these are all in place, I can push them back into position and then flip them around and rivet the rear spar to them without any clearance issues. And you'll find that when you have structures throughout the aircraft, in the rudder and the wings, where you've got multiple ribs that have to be riveted to a spar, in some cases you do have to back rivet at certain stages in order to be able to accommodate the tool head And it doesn't matter if you're using the big pneumatic one or you're using the hand squeezer. Either way, you still have to be able to get in there. So I'm going to pause the video and go ahead and set up the tripod so you can see how easy it is to rivet these together once you've got them set up. So hang on just a second. Okay, so I don't have zoom on this camera, but it works pretty well. For back riveting, essentially what you're going to do is you're going to cleco the rivets together to the spar and go ahead and get, you know, on most of these I only have 3 rivet holes except for maybe where there was an oops. There are places where I had to drill some extra rivet holes because I made a mistake or whatever else, but for the most part you're going to have A4 rivets going all the way through. On the sections where there's no rib in the front, you can just rivet from the front. On the sections, on these nose ribs, you essentially have to rivet from the back unless you want to bend the flange out of the way. The biggest thing with the air riveter or pneumatic riveter is you want to keep, I've pre-loaded a rivet into this center hole. You want to make sure that you keep the tool head square with the workpiece and then just give it a squeeze. And that's it. It sets the rivet for you. The way to check the rivet to make sure that it's set properly is whether or not you can get your fingernail under it. The Zenith custom rivet set here that you order when you order a hand squeezer from them, and it's best just to get the hand squeezer and the custom machined rivet heads from them. They give you an A4 and an A5 cupped rivet set, and that will thread directly into this Harbor Freight riveter. So it'll interchange with the hand squeezer, which is here. This is the hand squeezer set. It'll interchange with this and the nose here. The easiest, and then the stem of the rivet goes into the rivet set like this. Now this is normally a countersunk rivet, but because of the custom machining that they do on the heads of these rivet sets, it actually domes it and then pulls it tight against the skin. So you can do this as a domed rivet as the finished product, even though you're starting with a concave or a flush rivet from the blind rivet. What I'm going to go ahead and do is start back riveting these things together real quick, and once I've got all my rivets set, I will flip it around and start attaching everything else. You can see how easy it is to move that rib out of the way because I'm back riveting this. The front rivet would take a lot more effort and it would stress the material a lot more to do that. So that is it for the center rivets on these things. So now what I'll do is I'll pull the top row of clecos out, because remember there's only generally 3 holes in each of these rivets. There's a couple where I've got more than that, but what I'll do is now pull the top clecos out so that I can get 2 rivet points on there, and then I don't need any more clecos once I've got 2 points for the rivets to hang on to. And it doesn't really matter if you preload the rivet into the riveter or if you preload the rivet into the material. You can do it however you'd like, in whatever fashion makes the most sense to you or whatever facilitates building more quickly. For me, preloading the material is usually the easiest way. Come back in with the riveter, move the flange out of the way, and draw the rivet down. Same thing over here. Top rivets put into the material. I'm holding the rivet head up tight against it and square. Actually, on this side I can go from the front because there's no rivet or no nose rib, so this side easier to go through and do that. Back over nose rivet here. Same thing on this one. I don't need the back rivet there. I'm going to go ahead and front rivet this one nice and tight. Back rivet this nose rib. Again, making sure that I'm holding the rivet head tool head square with the work piece because I don't want to have a rivet head set in an offset fashion. Now, just in case you're wondering, this is the pop rivet itself is aluminum, is an aluminum rivet, but the core is a steel. It has a steel core, so the stem and the bulb in the center that forms the rivet when it pulls through is steel. So if you're going to take your material to the recycler, keep in mind that these are steel, and if you mix them at the scrap yard, you'll get a better price if you give them just a big pile of aluminum from all your scrap from making parts versus a mixed pile of aluminum and steel. If you're going to recycle these little stems, make sure that you keep them separate from your pile of aluminum. Alright, so I've got the top rows done. Now basically I don't need any additional clecos. There's only one cleco left in each rib anyway, so I don't need any additional clecos in anything. This one you can see is a black cleco. That's an A5. I ended up having a slight offset to that hole when I match drilled everything. So that needs to be set with an A5, and since I already have the A5 rivet set in the hand squeezer, I'm just going to go ahead and do that rather than change the tool head out. But same kind of thing here. Back rivet this. Making sure that the tool head is as square as I can possibly get it with the rivet. And the workpiece. And on these A5s, it generally takes between 3 and 4 squeezes to get it to set properly. And then it snaps off. Set pretty well on that one. So that rivet is that rib now is basically done. That'll draw back into position. Once I'm done riveting the skeleton together, I can take all these A4 clecos out and finish riveting these from the back or the front, depending on the location. You don't need a ton of, on a short span piece, you don't need a ton of clecos. However, I'll install more clecos along this surface when I rivet all the locations on the front where the doublers are, because that will, if you want to keep your pieces clamped tightly together so you don't end up with a bulge in the center where the rivet tries to bulge out between the two pieces of material. So for the most part, you won't have too much of a problem with that on anything, but you know, on these non-factory made parts. Well, that one's going to have to be drilled out. That did not set properly. So, I'm going to have to drill that one out. And it's because I went from the back again, and I really should have went through the front, but there's a nice big gap for me to get my fingernail under there, so I'm going to have to drill that out. But you really don't need a fixture to get them out. If you end up oversizing them a bit, then you can just drill them out to A5. I popped right out. Once I drilled the head off of it, back to an A4 rivet from the front. Draw it down nice and tight. Now that I've got it halfway assembled here, I can maneuver it around to accommodate what I'm doing. Make sure sure I use the right size rivet. So back riveting is less than ideal just because you have stuff in your way. It's harder to get the tool head down in against the spar and things like that, but there's just no choice on these ribs that have to be done from the back. So you basically just kind of have to decide which way you want to do it. The assembly manual will actually show you where they want you to back rivet everything and stuff like that, and that's a pretty good guide. It's a very good guide, in fact. It's just that I found that in certain places where, you know, things aren't exactly the way you hope they turn out, especially from plans building, you have to improvise a little bit. But as long as you get the fastener in the places that it needs to be, you'll have no problems. Okay, so you can see back riveting along this side, the formed head, the shop head, if you will. There's not really a shop head to the rivet, but that's the pulled side of the rivet, and then the domed side over here, where they dome up tight to the material and form a nice tight seal. So back riveted versus front riveted. Now that I've got all that together, what I'll do is I'll set some more clecos along this length here, and I'll rivet all these forward pieces into place. That'll make it easier. I can just go right down the line. There's no other structures that have to be bolted to this except for the mounting brackets here and here. So I'm going to set those first, and then I'll do the rest of the A4s. And you guys don't need to watch that. This is a long boring segment, so I'm not going to film that. But essentially, I'll just go all the way up and down the line with A4 rivets and set all those doublers in place. All right, so real quick, I just wanted to touch on a couple things while riveting. So as you can see here, I've got all the front rivets done on this spar, except for where I've got to attach my mounting brackets with A5s. I just want to say you do want to be careful. It's really easy to get going to town with a rivet gun and just start hammering away on these rivets and accidentally, rivet into something. Now these are A5 versus A4 holes here for the mounting brackets, but if this was a structure where it had the same hole sizes and everything, you could easily just kind of rifle through there, not realizing that you're actually riveting over something that still needs a part attached to it. Likewise, I could have ended up accidentally doing that with the nose rib locations where they needed to be attached to the rear ribs and things like that. So you want to be careful. But since I paused the video, I think it took me 5 minutes, maybe 10, to do all these rivets on the front spar, not counting the rivet station or rib stations. So, Zenith says that you can build this using no more than a hand squeezer, but let's get real. If you want to make real progress on this plane, you have to have compressed air. You need pneumatic tools. It's no different than if you're drilling or riveting or anything like that. There is no doubt areas where you have to use the hand squeezer because you just can't get access with the pneumatic riveter. But at, I think, $40 for this Harbor Freight pneumatic riveter, which I'm pretty sure will last the length of the project. If it doesn't, I've got the 2-year extended warranty on it, so they'll just give me a new one. And I think it was $40 for the riveter and then an extra $10 or $15 for the warranty. So well worth the investment, and you can literally just go right down the line popping rivets in, once every few seconds. If you want to do this all by hand for bragging rights, or you simply don't have the money for a pneumatic, riveting system or a compressor, more power to you. But from a scratch built standpoint, I really, really don't think it's practical to do this without compressed air. And once you have the compressed air, you can make much more progress much more rapidly. So after you're done riveting, of course, the rivets, after each one, just take a good look at it, make sure you've got everything flush set. Where there isn't any places to catch your fingernail. It's not as critical as it is with driven rivets. So solid rivets, you basically have to check with a rivet gauge on each rivet to make sure that you've set it correctly, because there's a lot of variables involved in that, and it's a lot of technique. But a pop rivet, as long as your material is clamped together adequately, there's not a lot of technique involved. As long as you're square up against the piece, you pull the rivet, it does the work for you, it sets it for you. So it's very easy to do. So just a quick check on the rivet head itself to make sure that it's drawn down flush and you can't catch your fingernail on it. Now the other thing real quick I want to point out is, if you look at these holes on the top of the spar, let me see if I can get close enough here and stay in focus. You see how that does not look like it's match drilled? It looks like it's offset there. Okay, the reason that happened is because the doubler that's underneath is not exactly shaped perfectly to the flange on the spar. There's a little gap in between it, and so when you clamp everything together, you start putting things under pressure and tension. Even with clecos in place, this stuff can have a tendency to kind of flex away from the material, so there's really not a problem with that. Once I get in there to rivet it, I can just, you know, it'll draw tight once I get the clecos in there, and I can force the cleco in and it'll pull everything into alignment where it needs to be. But you may find you'll have that, especially in areas where there are doublers. You'll have some holes that'll end up being offset, and the doubler just has to move a little bit to line those holes back up. There'll be a slight gap in between the two pieces of material, but frankly that's stronger anyway if there is a little gap there, and it's not going to affect anything. And that just happens when you start clamping things and putting things under tension and putting things under pressure, and then you start drilling and adding clecos. Things will, you know, it almost looks like it's misaligned at this point, but it's not. One thing you do not want to do in a situation like this for a part that's already been match drilled and then lines up like this is you don't then want to go back and re-drill these holes, because you will end up with the top hole will, you know, still be the top hole, but then the bottom hole will have, you know, an egged out hole on the bottom, and you don't want that. This stuff will line back up once you put the clecos back in there. And you know, down here it's more lined up as you start progressing with clecos along the length of it. When you start putting the skin on it, it'll line itself back up. Those holes will be back in alignment without too much problem. So just you know, observation on that. Do not re-drill match drilled holes to, you know, open up some more material, because then you have no clamping force. You only want the hole to be the size of the rivet. So that's about it on that. It's also amazing to me, even though when the structure is clecoed together, how strong it is. But once you add all the rivets, it's amazing how much more rigid and how much stronger it is once the rivets are all added. So, you know, it's pretty structurally sound with just clecos in it. But then once you go through and set all your rivets, it's crazy how much stronger that structure really becomes. So I'm going to flip it over, add the rear spar, rivet all that together, get the doublers in place, and then we'll see about attaching the skin and the brackets. Okay, so I didn't want to add a bunch of long boring footage of me ratcheting down that skin again, but you can see there's a rather high number of clecos on the skin right now. And we talked earlier, I showed you earlier about those holes that, you know, appear to be kind of not lined up. And when you are trying to rejig or re-cleco, you know, 3, sometimes 4 layers of metal, depending on, you know, if there's a rib station or if it's just a doubler and a spar and a skin, you know, just the slightest little bit of offset for 3 or 4 holes that have already been match drilled, you know, depending on the tension that you had on the skin or the, you know, exact angle you had everything when you drilled it the first time, it's really hard to line those back up sometimes. And so if you don't use a lot of clecos, you cannot get the rivets in the holes. The clecos, although they're not as strong as the rivets, when you use a ton of clecos up and down, I mean even every other hole or every couple of holes up and down the length of this, that'll have a tendency to draw everything back into alignment together. And you still often will have to really, you know, wiggle a cleco around to kind of get it to center down into those holes before you can pop the cleco down in. And then it's the same thing with the rivets. A lot of these rivets, you know, you really have to push pretty hard on them to get them to kind of center down, you know, center the holes all back into the matched position so that the rivet will go right down into the hole. And the biggest area where that's a problem is where the very tips of the rib stations are, because the ribs are made out of 16,000ths, so they're very thin. And the slightest little misalignment, if you're pushing down on a piece that's kind of slightly misaligned, you can actually bend the metal, you know, down away from the hole and miss it entirely. So you have to make sure that you get these alignments, you know, pretty darn good. And so now I can pull all these clecos out. The bottom side of the stabilizer stays clecoed and not riveted until you get the elevator mounted and the hinge plates and everything bolted together and aligned properly. So the only part that gets final riveted up to this point before you construct the elevator is the top side of the horizontal stabilizer, which then you lay flat on the table upside down and align your elevator in that fashion. But so I'm going to go ahead and remove all the rest of these clecos and finish riveting all these holes on this side. There's a nylon or nylon oil bearing block that gets riveted here with a piece of L, but I need to leave that off because I need to have this down flat against the table surface when I line up the elevator. So that stays off for now. And you know, that's a lot of rivets, but that pneumatic gun just makes very quick work of it. But anyway, so I'm going to finish up riveting this side of the skin, and we will get back to it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this horizontal stabilizer video series, and let me know if there's anything else you want to see. That's all for this video. Be sure to like, comment, or subscribe, and let me know if you have any requests for future video content. As always, thanks for watching, and good luck with your projects.